firstly, thank you for inviting me to talk about EVALOC. I do have a bad throat. I seem to get bug of the month through my young kids going to the nursery. So please bear with me if I cough. Firstly, I want to really thank and congratulate the organizers because you managed to bring together at least 5 of the 7 projects that were funded through Energy and Communities. So it's good for me to actually see what others are doing because we haven't seen each other for, I think, over a year now, so that's good. EVALOC is one of the projects that was funded. I am the principal investigator on the project. It's looking at evaluating the impact, effectiveness, and success of low-carbon communities on localized energy behaviors. Given the nature of the audience we have here, I might skip a few obvious slides. What I'm going to talk about is give you an overview of the project. How we are operating the research at the community level, at the household level. So I was very interested in some of the things that were being talked about here, and some emerging messages and final thoughts. We still have just over a year to go, so I would keep the messages as emerging rather than any final messages. In terms of the project background, it's a 3.5-year project. It was through the Energy and Communities call, just over £1 million. It ends end of June. In fact, before I explain the project, it's important to mention that the program itself received 82 proposals. There was a lack of reviewers actually, because everybody was involved in putting the bids together, and there was a lot of delay in getting the results out. But that shows how much interest there is in Energy and Communities. What this project does, EVALOC, is it evaluates 6 communities, and these communities were in place at this stage of the bid. So, they were to some extent, I wouldn't say involved in writing up completely, but they were involved in giving quite a bit of feedback, which was a challenge, but I think proved helpful for us. These were funded under the Low Carbon Communities Challenge, and I'll come to this program as well. We are evaluating them in terms of their impacts on changing individual and community energy behaviors, in terms of their effectiveness on achieving real energy savings and carbon emissions, and in terms of their success in bringing about sustained and systemic change. It's quite important to look at real savings because, as I will show, there is a bit of a performance gap sometimes. I do a lot of building performance evaluation and post-occupancy feedback on buildings, and working with people, and there is a difference between intent and delivery, and it's very important that that's borne in mind. The team is reasonably large. Please don't take the 8 as being 8 FTEs. We wish it was there, but it's not. Nobody's full-time actually. So apart from myself, it's Nick Eyre, Sarah Darby, Karen Lucas are co-investigators. We have 4 researchers on the project, Laura, Joe Hamilton, Ruth Main, and Tara Hipwood. Essentially, the project brings together social science and building science together from Brookes University and University of Oxford. We've got a large project advisory group, and we managed to build in some international visiting research fellowships within the project. So we have researchers who visited us last year from the States, Sweden, Austria, and India. And it was good to actually see some best practice across the world in energy and communities. What is the context of this research? I might be quicker here because this is a converted audience to some extent. We all know how important community groups are. I've personally been involved in doing community group work since 2002. I actually wrote the Climate Change Action Plan for Oxford City as well, about 8 years back. So yes, I'm very passionate about why community groups are important. One, they are very much involved and they are familiar with the contextual factors which can help to change individual behaviors. They can of course deal upstream as well with decision makers and midstream as well with other community organizations and encourage peer-to-peer learning. But why is evaluation so important of this action? Because one, if we don't evaluate, we don't know how we are doing and we can't reflect on what to do further. So they can help to promote community dialogue, shared learning, not just policy, but inspire further action. I think that's quite important. Although we are now reaching the stage where we are having a national and local community energy strategies, we shouldn't forget that it's very inspiring to do this work and work together. This program is slightly different from LEAF. Does anybody know about Low Carbon Communities Challenge? Yeah. Great. This was actually before LEAF. I was involved in a LEAF project in Bicester, so I know the two programs quite well. This was essentially a longish term program, I would say. It ran from 2009 to 2011. It had 2 rounds again. 22 communities got funded, about £450,000 each. The difference from LEAF was that it was funding KIT, so it was capital funding for low carbon technologies with some behavior change, but very limited. Some communities, in fact, one of the communities we are working with, managed to build quite a lot of behavior change into the program. The commonalities between the 22 projects were they were area based, so they were quite geographic. They involved integrated packages of measures and tended to use models of behavior change, nudge, and other things. Now, this actually led to LEAF because this is considered slightly long term, and then LEAF was very short term, so they come with their own nuances. Our communities are 6 of these, all of them are funded through LCCC. You might know some of them might be here. This is Sustainable Blaken, which had energy management scheme and 2 eco houses. This is essentially community led. Low Carbon Hook Norton, which is a community-led scheme looking at providing interest-free loans to whole house retrofits. Avalamantave, which was mentioned here, which is a community-led scheme which is looking at a proposed wind turbine. Eco Easterside in Middlesbrough, which is a community and council partnership, and that's quite interesting because it's somewhere in the middle, very successful. 600 homes with energy monitors and insulation. Kirklees, which is council-led and looking at community and domestic solar PVs and energy awareness, and the Low Carbon West Oxford, which you might be aware about, so looking at community and domestic solar PV and energy awareness. So we had a good mix across the country, council, community, and mixed partnerships, and they were involved right from the beginning stage. So we didn't recruit any community after we got the project, and I think that's something that I learned. Probably the harder way. It was difficult to manage because there are challenges in doing this as an academic. Working out with communities at the proposal stage is challenging, but I would encourage that as a learning, that I think to have these arrangements in place helps, because you can also put in funds for the communities within the proposal rather than adding them on. So academically, what questions are we trying to answer? I won't read every question because you can read them, but I'll just highlight a few. The first one is quite important. How can community-based organizations monitor and communicate their own effectiveness and energy demand reduction, and if there are any limits and barriers? What are the effects and impacts of community interventions, particularly on behavior change, energy, and carbon? We are exploring a carbon mapping approach in the project, which I'll come to shortly, called Decorum. And we want to look at how successful that is in communicating carbon savings to communities. How can energy displays be used to raise further awareness? What is the role of social networks in doing this? And what's the role of cross-learning? And these questions drive the project, of course. Essentially, it's action research, and as you all know, action research has a cycle of action and reflection. But most importantly, communities become co-researchers to some extent, helping in design, implementation, and interpretation of the program and outputs. And as I said before, it's challenging because you have to build more time, you have to negotiate things as well. And the other bit, of course, is qualitative and quantitative methods, which I'll come to. In terms of our work streams, there are 2 levels, looking at community and household level, which leads to knowledge exchange. And then we have focus groups, community events, stakeholder meetings, energy display library and trials, monitoring and evaluation, carbon mapping, social network analysis. So there's quite a bit of, as we call it, the chaos, and we're still trying to unravel some of it and get findings. But hey, it's a research project. Okay. Now, we organized this conference last year in Oxford. Was anybody from here there? I know one was, yes, or 2. Bridget was speaking as well. So this was an International Energy and Communities Conference which was held. It was an EVALOC conference. We had about 80 people, and we had speakers from quite different parts of the world. It was fairly successful. All the presentations are available. There's a conference report as well. And again, similar messages were coming through, about community action. And we had an interesting session on Green Deal. So we had the person who chairs the ministerial committee on Green Deal to speak, and there was an interesting session there. That's the website if you want to download things. I'll jump into community level research and just talk about what we are doing there. So of course we are looking at these things of impact, effectiveness and success, and we are organizing a range of community events with the communities and measuring, if it has any effect on behaviors, and then adding to the resources of the community. So they are co-designed. We are running 3 rounds of focus groups with each community, which means 18, because we have 6 of those. And that's essentially looking at, the first round looked at what was the effect of DEC funding. And, there are similar findings from LEAF that, some people thought that actually it did distract them from their main activity. Then the round 2 looks at where the community wants to be in future. And round 3 then looks at, reflection overall and some stakeholder meetings. The community events are wide-ranging, but we could categorize them under like knowledge and information, show and tell, or shared learning. Shared learning is the most popular actually. You'll see that figuring in almost all the community groups. I'll give you some key findings or reflections from one of the workshops which I thought might be relevant, was on partnership working. So we got 3 community groups together, and we did this actually as part of the Low Carbon Communities Network Conference held in Oxford last year. And some of the things that came out were, a partnership working is required to increase the reach and scale. But there are pros and cons, and we've got all the examples, like Kirklees is a local authority-led example, Easter Side is a partnership approach, and low carbon Oxford is an enabling approach. But there's some need for government investment to define these core roles carefully. And if we compare the strengths and limits of local authority-led, it becomes evident that local authority-led initiatives can reach low-income areas as well, but they are very limited in changing behaviors and engaging with social norms, whereas community-led approaches tend to be very effective in doing that. But community action is quite limited when it comes to uptake of new technologies, and that's becoming clear as I show you some of the monitoring and evaluation later on. I'm not going to go through all the events, but we've done a range of events, and some of them are here through school plays, and that was quite successful, with kids talking about climate change and messages, arts and creativity. I think there's much to learn from arts as well for this area. And what were the emerging learnings? One that strikes me most is events were seen as the glue that sustains community action. They're social, enjoyable, and there's a message, apart from encouraging peer-to-peer learning. And these are some quotes from the people. I'll let you read them actually. More or less positive from most of the attendees. We've had range of focus groups as well. So we've had, there have been wide-ranging topics of discussion, but focusing on, for instance, the LCCC program, which was DEC funded. So yes, it led to the accelerated implementation, but there were changes to goalposts. There was no ongoing support, and that's quite important. And then there was, reflection on the roles of low carbon community groups, their roles downstream, midstream, and upstream, the structural constraints that community groups have. It is, as already said before, it's run on, volunteers, and how much can they do and for how long. The other bit is we looked at the household level research, and we were looking at that in terms of energy, carbon, and behavior change. And there are lots of things that we are doing within household level. I'll just give you a flavor of a few things. We're looking at a carbon mapping approach, looking at very detailed monitoring and evaluation of houses, libraries, and social network analysis. And one of the things we are doing is creating carbon maps like this, this is a decorum carbon map which can estimate energy use and emissions on a house by house level, and then predict potential for reductions on a house by house level. This is then used to engage with householders in the community groups. It can also predict, like for instance, this is showing you which houses can take up what measure. So the pink ones can take up solar thermal. Sorry. And on an individual level, it can create detailed charts about what can be done in a house. And we are trying to link it with real-time data now from monitoring. We've actually recruited 88 houses across the communities. It was actually 90. 88 sounds like a strange number, but two have dropped out over 2 years. So there are three groups. Group A are those houses which have had physical treatments through the DEC funding. So insulation, solar thermal, solar PVs. Group B have had behavior change interventions, which could be having an energy display, or they might want to have energy displays. And Group C is the control. We're not trying to run a statistically valid sample here. It's more to understand the context. So there are about the Group A or B and C's are, they have all kinds of built forms that are prevalent in the housing stock, and it's very important that we look at a wide variety because there's a lack of evidence base anyways in the area of household energy use. It has different age groups and different kinds of household compositions. We have a graduated approach to monitoring and evaluation. So for Group A, it's the most intense. We are looking at measuring the fabric performance using thermal imaging and doing actual U-value tests to find out heat loss. Smart metering, we've actually installed whole house monitoring systems which give us data every 5 minutes remotely on environmental conditions, user interaction with, for instance, windows, which has a big effect on energy use. We've done, of course, semi-structured interviews with occupants. They have a heating control questionnaire, activity logging sheets, thermal comfort diaries, and then it reduces slightly with B, which is slightly light touch. They don't have whole house systems, but they still have sensors. And then Group C, whom we don't want to contaminate too much because it's like a control, although it's more like a reference. And this is hot off the press now. This isn't published, so I've got to be careful. This is data across ABC, and this shows you from the year 2009. That's when this is just before DEC funding, and then 10 and 11. This is gas consumption across across Group A over the 3 years, and you can see there's a noticeable. The first thing you notice is that there is a big variety. It does vary. So each of those bars represents a house. And you can see how much the variation is in terms of gas consumption. I'm just using average for the sake of it. We wouldn't normally use that. But it's just to show that there was a noticeable reduction between 2010 and 2011 when average, let's say, consumption of 15,000 kilowatt hours went down to 13,852. Some houses have had more, some houses have had less. Group B, which had behavior change, also had a bit of reduction in the same year. So behavior change is somewhere working. We want to look at, of course, 2012 and 2013 as well. And Group C's, just to make a note that the socio-economic context of Group C's is slightly lower than Group A's and B's. So their overall consumption is less, but not much change in terms of gas consumption. If you look at electricity consumption, and that's where it gets a little more interesting, some reduction across Group A's which have had physical interventions, possibly because they've had solar PVs installed which are generating electricity. Group B's, not much, and that there's a learning here that behavior change activities which are looking at electricity related behaviors are very challenging to sustain because we have a tendency to add things in the house, add appliances. And then Group C's reduces a bit, but I think that's probably because of other reasons. So this is something that we are looking into. We have data for every house, so we are going into, yes?
Excuse me, but between 2009 and 2007, there seems to be an increase.
Yes, that is because, the reason is we had a very cold winter that time. So there's generally an increase and you will also notice it in gas consumption. If you remember, it was quite a cold. I've purposely not weather corrected it because I feel that once you weather correct things, they get a bit strange. It's better to just show the raw data first.
But it also makes it difficult to make any conclusions from 2010 to 2011.
Yes, I wouldn't make any conclusions from this. It is more to show the patterns that work. Because one of the reasons we can't make a conclusion straight away is look at the variation in the bars. There's lots. But yes, we should be able to do that. I'll show you some other very detailed graphs in a bit. This is thermal imaging that we've carried out. This is an uninsulated house, so you can see the red ones are where you can see heat loss. But interestingly, these are improvements that have been done. So this is internal wall insulation, so the blue bit corresponds to that. But because only a part of the house has been improved, there are other areas which are becoming pathways of air leakage, or heat loss. And it's quite important to bear that in mind as we start to take this action, because you could have unanticipated outcomes. There are inconsistencies in wall insulation, and I'm not going to name the communities, where it's happening, but sometimes you can see it's done properly as well, and there are reasons why it's done properly because of the nature of how the installers were recruited. Sometimes it's not. And you can see the contrast in loft insulation and cavity wall insulation. So the loft is insulated, the wall isn't, and that's why people encourage whole house retrofit sometimes. But let's look at one house. Now this is counterintuitive. The green is actually uninsulated, which I realized should be the other way. And the blue bit is a house, one of the houses which is insulated, has double glazing. And let's look at the internal temperatures. And the blue one corresponds to the improved house, is as expected better. If you look at relative humidity, we expect it to be somewhere between 40 to 60%, and it's okay. But look at the air quality, and that's much poorer in the house that's improved. And the reason is because it's very airtight, and we have to be very careful with this. How much the airtight houses, maybe people are spending more time there. Because I'm running out of time, I'm probably going to skip this slide and show you some attitudes towards climate change. In these communities, there has been an increase in, if you compare the data from LCCC to EVALOC, there's certainly more increase in concern for climate change. There's a little bit of a decrease in behavior in, whether reducing carbon footprint is a normal thing to do, and that's because maybe A and Bs consider themselves to be exemplars. And there's more in C probably because the impact of the community is growing to houses which were not affected before, and it's beginning to happen. Interestingly and thankfully, most of the people think that the low carbon community has had some impact on community energy use and household energy use. And you can see why it's very difficult to actually sustain these behaviors. So we've asked the same questions that LCCC program asked. Remember, the sample is different, so I'm not trying to compare. This is more to just see what's happening. But it's quite difficult to sustain these because it depends on comfort, costs, hassle factor, daily routine of people. And that's why, and you can read some of the quotes. Being an electrician, I know where the money goes, but you get to the point where you start penny pinching. The effort overcomes the gains. Physical impact of low energy improvements, some positives. So, people with air source heat pumps are saying, you pick up your heat and it stays there. There aren't any hot and cold areas. Positive one with cavity wall insulation, not so positive with loft insulation. The reason for mold is probably because it hasn't been done properly. What is the effect on behaviors, whether it's energy consuming or energy saving? The same house or a different house with air source heat pump, but now with this air pump, I leave all the doors in the house open. Household with solar panels, we've got a fridge and we've got a dishwasher. We didn't use a dishwasher for a couple of years, but now we do because we've got the solar PV. And that happens all the time. I think it's very important to bear that in mind. There are both positive and negative outcomes of doing this. This is happening as I speak. We are testing both energy displays and environmental displays, so making energy and environmental conditions visible. I'll let you read this for 5 seconds. So again, there's a mix. Some people want to sing from the roof, whereas others find it such a fiddle. I know CSE has done a study on this, on the energy displays, but I think it's a design problem. There is we can understand an iPhone without a guide, but these displays are quite poorly designed, and the feedback we get from people is that they can only look at it for a few months, and after that it becomes irrelevant. And I think it's quite important to actually embed other functions within that display as well, which is why we are trying something called an environmental display, which is this one, which talks about indoor air quality, and that encourages people to actually understand what their air quality, temperature and humidity levels are. And in fact, people don't want to give it back now. Before I end, just to talk about the social network analysis that we are doing, we are actually tracking how energy messages are happening, and this is very, very early analysis, but it's showing that the low carbon community is the node. diffusion of information is taking place. There is a degrees of closeness as well. People who are very close to each other, they need to talk more with those people about energy messages. And some emerging messages before I end, because my time is almost over, I understand. At the household level, we find that the monitoring and evaluation is a useful approach in noticing the gaps between intent and outcome. This will become even more evident as community groups, as local authorities start to improve houses. Thermographic surveys are important. One of the things we don't talk about much is the linkage of community groups with the universities, actively, not just through LEAF grants or LCCC, but getting MSc students to do dissertations or PhD students, because that's quite a nice link. Monitoring is difficult to do. Space is limited but important, because then only we understand actual behaviors. We've done, and I haven't talked about that, we've done a big survey on usability of controls within the house, where people have controls but don't use it. So there's a difference between having and using, because they don't understand how to use them. And if community groups are looking at increasing adoption of technologies, they need to be provided with guidance on installation and commissioning. Most of the systems, unfortunately, we looked at for solar thermal are actually not working. They're not. They don't have the necessary things that need to make them work. People are having very high bills in some of those houses, so we have to be very careful. So this gap is quite important. This new technologies, old understanding. We need to bridge that gap. From a community level, we found there's no consistent methodology. There's some sophistication in some groups, but not everywhere. Most of the communities would like support from academics. And we've also conducted a wider survey with Transition Network and other networks to look at that. And we've got a similar knowledge exchange project to promote that. You all know about it, so I'm going to end here and say thank you.